All right. So, Ashley, tell us who we have today who's joining us.
I'm welcoming Haym Gross. So Haym is a architect with a focus on sustainability and has also been sort of the founder, one of the co-conspirators behind this NYC 2030 initiative, which is sort of the basis of how we got connected around your work there. And I helped out with a few webinars. We did some events together. We had a bunch of stuff planned when the pandemic hit.
Yes.
So we had to move online for a bit. But yeah, so Haym, could you tell us a little bit about, specifically the first time you remember getting interested in sustainability and architecture? Were those things always merged together in your mind, or were you interested in both independently? But yeah, give us a little backstory and history about how that sparked your journey.
When I started studying architecture, which was as a kind of adjunct or a follow through from art, I started as a sculptor. I pretty quickly saw that there was a big missing piece. And as I did sort of research and study, I learned that there was a lot of nature in architecture before modernism as we sort of know it and the modern machine age as we know it. And there is a movement, as we most of us know, going back probably to the 60s, earlier really in terms of technology, but certainly in terms of style, going back to the 60s and then in phases back, to the dawn of time, right? So there's a whole organic architecture movement that Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright were, sort of part of in the, late 1900s, early 20th century and beyond. But I saw it as a way to engage design, and really as almost as if selfish artists saw it as an opportunity for design. And then as the climate awareness grew to massive proportions, through my life, it became more and more of a kind of a mission. But I still have that selfish desire to make things beautiful through sustainability and all of the integration of energy and natural systems in architecture and urban design.
So, Haym, can you tell us a little bit about getting involved with NYC 2030? How did you first hear about this initiative? What were the steps involved? And then I want to talk a little bit more about, the grassroots nature of organizing, because I think that's the sort of ethos behind a lot of good standing initiatives, is people like yourself seeing a problem that can't get solved with government alone. It can't get solved by one company or even private industry alone. So it's really groups like NYC 2030 who need to come together and provide some ways for people to plug in, whether on the government level, the private industry level. So I'm interested in NYC 2030, both as, a solution for people getting involved to address climate within their own cities, but also just as a model of grassroots organizing. So from that perspective, tell us about the origin story there.
It's kind of an interesting story, and it's been a long haul so far. There is a group called Architecture 2030, which was started by an architect out of Brooklyn. It turns out a guy from Pratt who went to New Mexico and became very successful doing fancy houses in the desert. And he had authored a book that I probably read when I was in architecture school on natural passive, the old idea of passive design, not passive house, but passive design where you use sun, wind, earth as a way to design a house that's very efficient. You may be familiar with earth berm houses, and we all know about shading and natural ventilating and those kind of things. And the idea was that this gentleman, Ed Mazria, piped up around the year 2000 and said, hey, we're worried about the climate. We're starting to talk about global warming, and we're all saying it's transportation and industry that's contributing all these greenhouse gases and carbon into the atmosphere. Turns out buildings and cities are major contributors, and this was something fairly new at that point. Architects all thought, oh, gee, we're really groovy, and people who did, nice buildings thought that they were doing the right thing, when in fact, about 30% of the greenhouse gases and carbon emissions in the United States come from buildings, and the power to serve buildings, the electricity that goes into lighting and plugs and plug loads and heating and cooling. And in New York City, it's more like closer to 2/3, closer to 67% to 70% of the greenhouse gases come from heating and cooling buildings and electricity that serves buildings, because we have kind of a dirty grid in New York City. But the idea is that the glass buildings that we associate with modernism that are served by mechanical systems are really crappy buildings in terms of energy use and efficiency, and some people think also in terms of comfort. So around 2015, I was looking around and saw that there wasn't a whole heck of a lot happening in New York City. There was a lot of people talking, a lot of studies being done, a lot of awareness, Earth Day and marches, what have you. People starting to talk about climate justice and environmental justice is an idea that was starting to really take hold. But I looked around and I saw not a lot was happening, and did a little research, found that there was this think tank called Architecture 2030, which was really beginning to investigate building energy and how that contributed to climate change. And out of that study, a group was formed in Seattle around 2011 to establish a district to really work on collaborative projects to create building efficiency and renewable energy, and really kind of hit the ground running on making these things happen. And so it really was a group of a partnership of commercial building owners, and the city was taking certain steps and what have you. But the idea that there was a collaborative and a community response started with that, and the districts expanded to Pittsburgh and to Denver and to other cities around the country. Around 2015, I looked into it and saw there wasn't really anything happening in New York City. Active, an active government. There were beginning to be some laws to control energy use and make some moves in that direction at the state level as well. But what was missing was a community engagement. And people were relying, as we rely on a lot of things in our society, we're relying on government at all stages or some stages, and private sector. We figure, if there's, if it's worth something, there's going to be some money made, and the market's going to take care of it. And that is partially true. There are many, many ways to create, value through energy efficiency or through renewable energy, and different ways to combine those things. But for the most part, individuals, people with Con Ed bills and people with, companies that, ship things or made things, what have you, as individuals would do their best to be sustainable, to not, use crappy chemicals and dangerous toxins, what have you, to not use too much energy. But everybody's pretty much on their own, because the government and the private sector treat us all as individuals. We're either customers, or we're taxpayers, or we're ratepayers. But there's no vehicle, there's no host or vessel for people to act as a community. And there's a reason for that. Because the government doesn't want us to act as a community, and private sector doesn't want us to act as a community. They all want us to be individual customers so they can treat us like retail, subjects to a great degree. Excuse me. And what was missing was some platform for people to collaborate in a fair way, in a productive way. And so the basic structure of the districts, the 2030 districts, is understanding that there are these different sectors. There's the private sector, the government, public sector, there are institutions, there are civic and community groups, and all of them act differently with respect to energy. Yes, we're all consumers to a great degree, but also we vote, and we also buy things, and we also, in our institutional lives, if it were part of a religious group or a community group or just a group of friends, or part of a school, what have you, we take collective action and we talk about things to make decisions. So the idea was the 2030 district would provide the platform for the different sectors to speak on an equal footing. Turns out that's not so easy. And also try to find common ground so that we could achieve benefits to the climate and public health and real, environmental benefits, real palpable environmental benefits that we couldn't achieve if we only relied, or that communities are the strongest advocates and the strongest stakeholders for, that the businesses aren't necessarily so interested in, or government isn't necessarily so interested in. And that's basic ideas played out over the course now of 10 years to the point where we've built a really, really strong group of partners in all these different silos, in property owners and managers, in civic and community groups, in service and professional, actual practitioners, people working on these problems in technical and business active business roles, and we've kind of achieved the point where I think we actually are speaking a similar language, which is quite an accomplishment, but also finding ways that we might achieve as a partnership things that clearly aren't being achieved by these other players.
I remember, I don't know, it was maybe a little over 10 years ago where there seemed to be a wider conversation about utilities, sort of public versus private, Con Ed, National Grid, if we're talking about New York. On one hand, it was like, hey, you don't want the government running these things. It's good that they're in the hands of essentially these private companies.
Right.
And then other people say, maybe it's not.
Yeah.
There's this thing going around right now that energy bills in New York City are set to at least double. Have you heard this?
Yeah, they're going up substantially, and there's a lot of, there is enough of a complex landscape, so there's room for a lot of misinformation. And there's also very clearly, at least two opposing camps.
Tell us about these two camps.
The two camps are basically, I would almost call it believers and non-believers. There are people who believe in science. There are people who believe in the projections of science. The whole basis for the designation 2030 in the name for District 2030, or the 2030 District Network, which now has about 25 cities in North America, that the scientists pretty much said, and they still agree as far as I know, that the year 2030 is kind of a break point for the climate. That if, it's pretty well established, again, to those who believe in science, that if we do not, as a planet, start to bend the curve of carbon emissions and which are primarily based on fossil fuel consumption, if we do not start to flatten that curve by the year 2030, the out years, the years heading towards the end of the century, will be really, really, can I say, fucked up?
You can say fucked up here.
Okay, I'm so glad we can say that, because the physics are what they are. You fill the atmosphere with this much carbon and other greenhouse gases, and we're going to start to overheat the planet, and that's what's happening. And by the way, the 2015 sort of introduction that I initiated, which was, we started our meetings at AIA in New York, and there's still a lot of members in the architectural community. At that point, we were 3 years out from Sandy.
Oh.
And Sandy was the big wake-up call for New York, which for a minute got everybody's attention, and there was a lot of reports and a lot of people making noises. But now it's been 12, 13 years since Sandy, or more. Every time we hit Halloween, it's like, hey, it's the anniversary. It's the anniversary of Sandy.
Right.
But as we know, globally, even if you don't have these big name disasters, we know the trends, and the trends are really, really bad, and they're even accelerating faster than the impacts, and the hurricanes and fires and floods are accelerating faster than were projected by the scientists, because the scientists were conservative. They weren't trying to scare people to death. And it doesn't seem that very many natural disasters scare people to death either. So the opposing camps, you asked about the opposing camps. The believers say, we got to just get this together if we care about our children, if we care about the planet. And we kind of know what we need to do. But we also are beginning to realize, I think, the believer camp, although everybody has their different angle, I think the believer camp is beginning to realize, and maybe this is led by, is he still the UN Secretary General? Name is escaping me. Forgive me.
Go on, I'll look it up.
Well, you'll look it up. But he's been a real leader, and so is our late Pope. A leader in making this point that this is a 5-alarm fire, all hands on deck. Everybody is saying this is an emergency.
This is Antonio
Gutierrez. Yeah, who's a real champion on these issues. So the believers say we need to do this, and we've been really, really working hard on it. And our former president Joe Biden was kind of a hero, I think, on this, quiet and subdued, but he made some very, very strong progress. And the non-believers, who are, whether or not they really know or care, they're essentially, driven by, their individual interests, and it's mostly money. And so, yes, there's been a lot of denial, and some of this is either anti-science or just discard science as a legitimate voice in these matters. But now what we have is, and we've seen in the last several months, is a full-out assault on the whole regime, or the whole picture of climate as being something that the world needs to address. We need to transition to a cleaner energy economy, and we need to get rid of the fossil fuels. And so there are two opposing camps, and I think it's fair to say that there's a little bit of fudging on each side, but the full-out climate denial and the sort of wholesale support of drill baby drill and fossil fuels is, I would hope, will be sort of defeated by the weight of its own lies. and by flooding and wildfires and just Mother Nature's wrath, which is upon us.
Yeah. Earlier this year, California, certain areas of California, especially, experiencing perhaps the worst wildfires they've ever seen, possibly. And then
not only California, we had them in New Jersey and New York.
Yeah, and like a lot of big things that happen in the world, including natural disasters, they have a lot of attention, and then that attention sort of wanes, and there's maybe some space, and then it's on to the next one, and then there's all this sort of gaslighting. I want to just not drive attention away from the current administration. Ashley and I just spent a lot of time sort of maneuvering through a lot of national and state parks throughout the Southwest. And, there seems to be this issue with drilling, logging in some of our most sort of sacred and protected parks. So on one hand, you have what seems to be a sort of soft or extremely hard isolationism in terms of not just manufacturing domestically, but energy sort of creation or drilling, natural gas, oil, and tapping into these otherwise sort of protected landscapes, right? So it's like a lot of these things being sort of defunded and then being opened up to drilling, the logging, fracking.
Yeah.
And so there's that. And you mentioned 2030 being across multiple states. I just want to pause. Obviously, we're in New York City right now. There's all these sort of urban issues. I want to talk a little bit about Mayor Adams, who wrote a great introduction in, I believe, 2022 to the District 2030 sort of like massive sort of PDF about the plan. If I'm not mistaken, he was a big champion of 2030.
Yeah.
His own sort of personal sort of things happening aside just for a moment.
But as Brooklyn Borough President, he was a strong supporter, yes.
He was a strong supporter. He wrote a pretty solid introduction to this larger sort of case study, if you will, in terms of the proposal and some of the research done, just certain things that could be done in not just Manhattan, but other boroughs. There's a part of me that's also thinking about Mayor Adams and his sort of mini crusade that really didn't go anywhere about all the pizza ovens in the city.
I missed that one.
Do you remember that one?
I missed that one.
He was a little upset about all these sort of raging, almost 24/7 pizza ovens across the city and how much heat and sort of how many emissions are sort of escaping. But we'll come back to New York real fast.
That's a tough sell. I don't think that you can really separate people from their pizza ovens. But let's also be realistic that a pizza oven, if you had a pizza oven in your own house that you use 3 times a year, that's one thing. But if you have a pizza oven that's actually feeding people, it's hard to argue. And it's kind of it's feeding people publicly. But in any event, Adams actually did some very good things for climate. He has a program, and Adams is somebody who I think is fairly on the he's like heading for the exits if he's smart. Maybe he'll return as a sportscaster or something, but I don't think his political life has very far to go. That is unless Trump just becomes the emperor and brings all of his acolytes aboard. I don't really know, but he did some things under his proposal called the City of Yes, which was intended to open up the city to business and try to relieve some of the regulations and taxes and things of that nature. And he did extend zoning for solar and batteries and building envelopes, building efficiency, insulation, et cetera. That have been called for a lot of years by people in the field. And he made that a reality. Whether or not it's going to succeed technically is an area where art and design comes into play, right? There's just so many things that engineers can solve. I know it's going to shock you, but there's a lot of art and design, a lot that art and design can do and need to do needs to do to integrate renewable energy and green building techniques and clean energy equipment into the environment as we know it. I mean, today, you can put up solar panels on the roof of a lot of buildings in New York City, but if you're in a landmark district, the sentimental, sort of visual needs of
The
whatever cultural demand it is to keep things pretty,
Yeah.
Will call the solar panels an intrusion.
Yeah.
And
We
so
ran into this. We went to in Taos, New Mexico. We went to basically a small panel discussion or a conference with people who were concerned about the fire risk in Taos in that particular moment a couple weeks ago. It actually snowed the following day after this conference. It was like a sort of like slight, almost like rain dance energy that I think brought the snow. But one of the issues, it seemed, in terms of votes, and obviously they're concerned about wildfires and how potentially disastrous that could be, especially in how dry it was at the moment in Taos, New Mexico. But one of the concerns was the landscape and how people's views of the mountain, the trees on the mountain, could be disrupted. And this is an aesthetics conversation for people who buy that property with a great view of the mountain or whatever it is, that they had discovered that you can't just do the sort of underbrush cleanup. There's a lot of issues about the grass and how fires sometimes can sort of surf the grass and spare the trees, the loss of the grasslands. But what they were saying was it was probably important and will continue to be important to actually remove these sort of strips or even potentially many acres of trees to create these sort of barren buffer zones to help prevent the spread of wildfires. So what this would mean in sort of like doing not just underbrush clearing, but actually taking trees down in specific areas to allow the grasslands to come back. I might be missing some important elements. Ashley, jump in if I'm missing this. But the conversation was a lot of the residents don't want to support this in legislatively or financially because the mountain would have essentially a sort of barren scar going through it. It would look ugly.
Yeah.
So they were running into this massive issue that people want the beauty of this town.
This is what happened in Cape Cod, and also was a concern in Long Island, where the folks with the fancy houses didn't want the offshore wind turbines to spoil their view. And so there are going to be those issues, and we could have probably a long conversation about equity and the concerns of the various classes in our society with respect to what one would have to agree is a pretty existential and widespread concern for the climate. And so what's more important? And does money talk? And is money the only thing that talks? So these are all important questions, and they appear everywhere across the board in these questions of energy and equity and the transformation of our built environment and our energy systems that we really need to achieve, unless we are going to be the unlucky ones who don't get on the Mars escape vehicle.
Katy Perry.
What?
Katy Perry.
Katy Perry. I don't think that her trip was long enough to be considered an escape. I think it was just kind of like
a brief sojourn.
Brief sojourn. It was
she failed the audition.
A small term. Maybe she did.
By the way, I just want to say on the record, Katy Perry, I support you, and I reject this online bullying. Okay,
that's right.
I want to just briefly.
By the way.
Okay.
There were, I know for a fact, properties in the area of Los Angeles, that was damaged by the wildfires, there were some properties that survived because they had years ago adopted a flock of goats to, eat up the grasslands around the parts of their property that would have allowed fire to spread onto, into their, and to endanger their houses. And there are, 1,001 solutions that don't involve, necessarily harsh. Probably you need to do some harsh if not logging, pruning and landscaping of areas around towns that might be subject to it. But again, this is where we are. Where we are is kind of caught between these enormous, falsely divided silos of solutions or ways to look at the problem. One of the biggest issues we have, and this is very relevant to what we're talking about with the fires, is we look at sustainability as or climate mitigation, which is, well, we have this long-term problem of greenhouse gases. How do we lower greenhouse gases so we lower the global temperatures, right? And that's sustainability. And then there's resilience or adaptation, which is concerned with how do we survive the flooding and the wildfires and the droughts and the threats to our food, food supply that come from extreme weather events and impacts of climate change. A whole nother question of immigration and forced migration with respect to climate change. So these are false choices. This is all part of the same problem, and it's another area where, if the academia and the policy geniuses decide these are two separate problems, resilience and sustainability, and they don't touch each other because you got to get 3 PhDs to talk about one and the other. This is a silly approach, and if you're a community and you're a community under threat, you don't have really the luxury to divide the problem this way. You're just as likely to suffer from a power outage, which will ruin all the food in the supermarket or what have you, as you are from a flood, depending on where you are.
I do think, a lot of problems present, but, our current president sort of forcing the hand on things, which is these sort of like siloed conversations. In Taos at this fire panel, you have the local professor, you have the local politician, you have the state senator, you've got, the just sort of volunteer fire bro who's very passionate, you have the fire chief, right? So you have all these different people. One of the issues there in Taos was the spotted owl. And they were finding that they had to do a lot of clearing and actually, again, like I mentioned earlier, chop down several acres to create these buffer zones to keep fire from spreading, right? So not only is it an aesthetic issue, but you have a lot of these animal activists who understand that the spotted owl lives in a lot of these trees and that's its environment, and that to cut these trees down is to put the spotted owl under threat. Trump was very vocal about the little fish in California that was preventing the water from coming down. Right. So what I'm saying is like these people, the people who really care about fire safety, the people who really care about the fish, the spotted owl, they might be sort of politically, ideologically on the same camp. They might be in the side of, hey, I trust science, but nevertheless, their particular passions and expertise are at odds with actually creating a beneficial situation or a preventative situation. So not to talk about what we do, what radical systems are, and what good standing is about. It's about, and this podcast is, we have to now have these slightly more nuanced and complex conversations that involve our political binary here, which is perhaps rightfully being sort of disrupted, hopefully, but to transcend those and to understand that people who may be in the exact same ideological, political camp are nevertheless potentially at odds in doing things that are beneficial to communities, to the larger sort of macro environment, right? So we have to start having these more nuanced conversations that don't get absorbed into the binary or these seemingly opposing camps. So regulation, right? This word regulation, right? Like this current administration is like, there's too much regulation. Of course, some regulation is good. Some regulation and conversations around regulation are essential to protect the environment, to protect human beings, the community, etc. And then there are situations where regulation is a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
You know, this is actually a really beneficial drug that needs to get out there. And, you know, maybe it doesn't fit into established paradigms. Maybe it's extremely disruptive to the establishment and that needs to get pushed through, but it's getting held up. Or, hey, you know, we need this water actually to move south, and this little fish, important though it is, perhaps we need to start having conversations that maybe move us towards some sort of compromise, right? So society needs to sort of matriculate, it needs to sort of graduate to a place where it's able to have these more complex conversations, right? And these people who may be in the same camp, suddenly they're at odds. And all their sort of instincts, their sort of contentious political instincts might come up, and these two people start squabbling while the climate deniers and someone run to the bank, you know. So right. I'm just saying, like, this podcast, this platform, is deliberately designed to host slightly more complicated, more complex conversations that can allow everybody to win who is doing the right thing or interested in doing the right thing.
Yeah, and you need to demand another range of options or another set of tools before you can actually achieve them and make them available. And so, you know, somebody's listening to that conversation about the fires in Taos, and somebody's listening to that conversation about the spotted owl and the snail darter or whatever fish it happens to be, and the question of water. And now we have our, I don't know, probably well over 100 years or a couple of 100 years since, the Industrial Revolution and the growth of modern society and all of its systems and all of its fuels and its emissions, what have you. We've seen Love Canal, we've seen Sandy's, we've seen the wildfires, and we're watching the destruction of the rainforests, and we're watching the melting of the ice caps and Greenland, what have you. So we're seeing these processes, and yes, thankfully there are young people, even younger than you.
Mm-hmm. No, we're very young.
You're very young. I know. But there are people even younger than you who see the very elaborate dance of institutions and political and government and business entities, big ones and little ones, and they hear the dissonance, and they see the inertia, and they know it ain't happening. I won't say that there's anything good about our new administration, except from the somewhat sort of that the unhappy consequence of being attacked is that
people
sharpen,
rally the troops.
Yeah, it sharpens the mind, and people begin to realize,
Yeah.
that they've got to change.
Are you suggesting Trump is doing this consciously?
I would think that he's certainly doing it. He's certainly doing it consciously. Whether he's doing it intentionally or responsibly is another question. He's certainly doing it consciously, and he's doing it with vengeance and and vindictiveness, and he's doing it dishonestly to a great degree. I mean, if you asked him, he'd say that he's the greatest champion of the environment that ever existed.
Let me.
But what I'm saying is that we absolutely need new relationships and new. We need new ways to communicate in our communities, and in our communities now are quite large, right? Because now, anybody who is thinking along similar lines can communicate instantly across the globe, right? So there's a lot of opportunity, but it's to my mind, it's the sort of connective tissue and the vehicles to kind of take us, together, like the mass transit vehicles, for lack of a better, a metaphor, that can take us together to some place that we haven't yet achieved. And there's, 100 solutions that we have worked with, that we're promoting in NYC 2030.
Okay.
Some of which are very specific to New York problems or urban problems. Some are just conceptual that can work anywhere. And all of the different groups, the groups that want organic food, and the groups that want clean water, and the groups that want to stop fracking, and the groups that want to expand solar energy, or just shut down that dirty power plant, whatever the case may be. All of these groups effectively want the same thing. And just as you say, we just don't have either the language or the solution that they could agree upon, or even necessarily the platform where they can have the conversations that you're describing to achieve those solutions. I think the solutions are here. We have actually an embarrassment of riches. Why the fuck should we care about the view of the,
I thought you meant the show The View.
The
I was
view,
like, Joy Behar and Whoopi? Of course we should care.
We should care, that's true. And they
I've
should
got
care
some
too.
issues there.
But why should we care about the view out the house in Amagansett or Taos, New Mexico? But we do.
We do.
Because culturally we care about image, and we care about wealth, and maybe that's the problem.
But also our spiritual, emotional, sort of mental health, and it's okay to have, I think, a beautiful environment. There's conversations there, but I just wanted to insert this real quick, and I'll throw it back to Ashley to probably ask a question I'm going to ask, which just furthers what you just mentioned about some of the initiatives within 2030 and what people in New York, being that we're here, can sort of do amongst these sort of disparate sort of issues or passion projects. But yes, I'm curious, what can we do as artists and designers in issues where necessary change, whether it's solar rooftops or, cutting that fire trail, I'm going to throw one more at you really quick. This is about what can artists and designers do in aiding sustainable choices, maintaining their sort of aesthetic beauty, to sort of help ameliorate or diminish the criticism that these necessary changes are ugly or obtrusive or something like that. What can artists and designers do? I just want to throw this one more Taos thing before we really firmly land in New York. Another complication. And what could this mean aesthetically and also culturally and spiritually? So, and we can probably do a real journalistic deep dive into Richard Nixon in the 70s and how he was actually, perhaps surprisingly, quite the champion of politics as it pertains to spirit sort of culture and repatriation on the reservation in Taos, New Mexico. He did a lot to help enshrine the protection of the mountain as it sort of slopes up behind the reservation, and also this sacred lake that he helped to repatriate and protect. But a representative from the tribe said, listen, we need to build a fire path up the mountain. But legislation from the 70s, which was really beneficial to the reservation then and still is, which is protecting this sacred mountain, the sacred landscape, and the lake further up the mountain. They're not able to now build this contemporary fire trail in because the mountain is sacred and protected. So you have this conflict, this inherent conflict, just even for that individual as a representative for the entire reservation, which is, to them, the mountain is sacred. The lake at the top of the mountain is sacred. And yet it's under threat by fire. And its protected sacred nature is now in the way of building this fire trail in. So another one of those sort of like nuanced things, like how do you navigate this? How do you update or sort of ratify that legislation to make room for this fire trail? And then now back to artists and designers, and maybe we can even come back to New York, which is, can we make cooler solar panels? Can they be ingratiated into rooftop gardens in a way that has an aesthetic element to it that isn't just
integrated
clunky
and ingratiated? That's really good. I have to really both. We can have both, right?
All right, so let's just stay for a minute in this thing that I know Ashley and I talk about this a lot, and we'll throw it to you in a sec, Ash. Sorry if I'm soaking up some oxygen here myself, What is this issue across the boroughs about doing what's necessary on our rooftops? And is it necessary? Meaning just the sort of the paint that helps refract light. Are there solar panels that can go on the roof? Are there roof gardens? So from the perspective of 2030, and I'm going to zip it after this one for a little bit, what's happening currently as far as you see it with the organization in New York in terms of, let's say just for now, and we can get into like the sea line and all these other things, but just on roofs, let's start there. What's happening with painting roofs in a way that's more sustainable, building solar, installing solar, roof gardens, just that particular issue? Let's just talk about that as far as you see it, the organization sees it in New York City. What's happening on our rooftops?
So let's back up a little bit step back and look at the surface. What does the sky see? What does the climate see when it looks down at a city? Right? It's a very unique place. Now, this is very much related, and if we're looking out decades, if we have decades, then we have a chance to make some change. But one of the things that we're very concerned about globally, here we are in the United States, where we sort of invented this car culture, this fossil fuel culture, which is, running our cars, running our power plants, factories, etc., based upon cheap oil and now cheap gas, relatively cheap gas. That culture leads to sprawl. That sprawl leads to the deforestation and the soil erosion and 100 different problems that are based upon a lifestyle of, more or less a suburban lifestyle that relies upon the car. That's not a particularly communal lifestyle. Let's be very realistic about this. Doesn't mean you can't be a community in suburbia, but the model is not based upon an efficient what's called the 15-minute city, or the the walkable city.
Right.
It's not based upon a close-knit community that has everything you need, within a 5 or 10-minute walk, and is not bound to the car and the sprawl of paving and parking lots and everything that the sprawl produces. New York City is very unique, and the cities, cities in general are unique in that they are dense. They rely upon this closeness and this natural way of getting around, of walking or riding a bicycle or even taking mass transit, that is inherently very, very efficient. The density of buildings is inherently very, very efficient, right? And not everybody is going to live on the Upper West Side in a building with 100 units or 500 units, whatever the case may be, and all of this shared, wall space and this density, which by itself is, efficient in terms of energy. Looking down at the city, what you see right now is a lot of black roofs, right? And so we have a thing called the heat island effect, where in New York City, and particularly in the low-income areas of New York City that have fewer trees and where the density of paving, of black rooftops and
less green space,
and a lot of concrete and a lot of paving, that can be 5 degrees hotter on a summer day in part of the Bronx than it would be out in either brownstone Brooklyn with a lot of trees, or some area in Queens with a lot of backyards. So there's a real difference in terms of the density and the lack of greenery, and also just the density of people, right? There's more people living in an apartment. There's more people using air conditioners, and the same thing is true of storm, the flooding that comes from just overloading our sewage system in areas. In New York has a combined storm and sanitary sewer system. So if you have a big rain event, as we've had, you'll overload the sewer system, and you're dumping. You might have flooding, which is terrible, and it might be unhealthy stuff that comes up. Or you could just be overloading the sewage treatment plants and pouring raw sewage into our waterways, which happens, right? So there are a lot of issues with respect to what happens on these rooftops, right? So if you have a green roof or a blue roof, a different thing.
What's a blue roof?
Blue roof is where you capture the rain from a heavy rain event, a downpour, right? That can cause flooding. You capture it in a tank.
It's like a little mini reservoir or something.
Exactly.
Oh, cool.
It's just a way to either hold it on the roof, or make the roof into a little bit of swimming pool, or you put it in some kind of a tank, and that tank can then go be used for
a hot tub, obviously.
For a hot tub,
no.
or for no, it's rainwater. It's clean, or irrigating your plants or your garden.
I didn't even know a blue roof was a thing. Thank you for that.
Thing.
Did everybody know about blue roofs?
There's green roofs and there's blue roofs, but there's also urban agriculture, and there's also a lot of synergy between solar panels and green roofs. They actually love each other. So here you have a solution for resilience and defeating the heat island effect, because the green roof absorbs that, it stays moist enough to absorb that heat, instead of the black tar roof, right? That's just going to reflect that heat right up in the air. So there's a lot of design options.
Okay.
As an architect and a designer, I'm engaged with some of those. I've worked on solar and storage, solar and batteries, and green roofs and canopy systems and what have you. There's so much to be done that needs to break out of the mold of what we currently think of as mechanical systems. We think of like, there's an air conditioning, or a boiler here, an air conditioning unit there, a cooling tower, what have you. We think of these things as things we almost automatically blind ourselves to. And in fact, when you see a mechanical thing on a roof that you don't know what it is, you sort of ignore it. It's kind of has to look like that because it's functional. It's got it's got some flue, it's got some vents, it's got some motor, whatever the case may be. renewable and clean energy is a different animal, right? The solar panels aren't related to how they're wired into the building. They're related to how the sun moves, right? A green roof is related to, it needs a certain amount of light, it needs some drainage, all the ways these things fit together. And now we have heat pumps, which are efficient and work on electricity, but rely on the air or the ground source for geothermal, whatever the case may be, to move thermal energy around, to move heat around. And that works more or less the same way in cooling or in heating. They're just pumps that move heat around. They use electricity fairly efficiently, but they still need a source, right? So doing these things individually, you stick your air conditioner in your window, or you have a heat pump system that might have a thing on the wall and an outdoor unit that's moving the heat in and out. If you do these things individually, we're keeping the very same relationship, the business relationship between you and, the company that
what we discussed earlier is sort of silos the individual, the tenant,
a tenant or a co-op shareholder or a building deciding, are we going to keep our boiler or are we going to do something different? But we don't have, except in very limited conditions or circumstances, a collective approach to this. So say, for example, you have a campus, a university campus. And the university may be out in the boonies, and it's got to have its own systems. But you also have hospitals and universities and critical facilities like fire departments or places that just need emergency power. Well, actually, data centers now need a lot of emergency power. Wow. But if you have these things and they're designed to sort of be independent and somewhat holistic and need to be kind of like a biosphere or a spaceship or something. I mean, they really exist on their own. They may be connected to the grid or maybe not. And by the way, there are some very large housing complexes in New York, Co-op City and Penn South and Rochdale Village out in Queens, that are big, old, affordable housing complexes which were built to be independent. They have their own heating, cooling, and hot water systems. And in fact, when Sandy hit, some of these, like Penn South, were the only ones that had power in Lower Manhattan because they had their own on-site power.
I remember when that transformer blew.
Right. And so the idea that you can do things at a community scale and be much more efficient, but actually be independent of potentially an outage or
interesting
is a concept that for the most part is alien to us as consumers, those of us who grew up thinking, you just pay your bill. They take care of it. It's their problem. You know what I mean? Yeah. Well, is it really just their problem? What happens when they fuck up the environment and it hurts all of us? And what happens when, 100,000 people have to leave their ancestral home because they can't grow food anymore? Yeah. And they're on the street.
Yeah. Let me just ask you real quick. Some of the spaces you mentioned that are somewhat contained, does 2030 as an organization work directly with some of those spaces you mentioned?
Yes.
How can...
And it's very hard to get them to think outside of their boundaries. So we work with the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We work with Pratt Institute.
Those big buildings along in the Navy Yard, those huge, long buildings.
Well, yeah. And a very old and complex infrastructure which has a power plant connected to it, which has a sewage treatment plant neighboring it, which is surrounded by, I think, 3 NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority projects. It was thousands and thousands of units. All of these things are separate because in our minds they're in separate properties. The Navy Yard has really complicated systems, a very old set of buildings that go back to the mid 1800s, and a bunch of new buildings that are brand new and modern. So yes, we are working with them. We're working with Pratt, And one of the concepts that we've been, frankly, having very little traction, getting very little traction on from the usual suspects, is that we need to have a community function like a campus. There's no reason there shouldn't be sharing of energy and energy loads and batteries and renewable energy tied together with on-site power in such a way that, say for example in Sunset Park, there's just as one example, in Sunset Park, which is a mostly low moderate income area, on the Brooklyn waterfront, which is subject to flooding. There's a gigantic bus depot. It's the Jackie Gleason bus depot. It's got like
Jackie Gleason?
It's the Jackie Gleason bus depot.
Why is it named that?
Because Jackie Gleason was a bus driver.
Oh, all right.
There we go. He was sort of like the model of the bus driver. But I swear to God, it's called the Jackie Gleason. And it's got like a 2-acre roof on it. And it's, it's where they keep all the buses and fix all the buses.
All right.
Now, maybe if you covered that roof with solar panels and had some batteries to spread the time, the dispatchability of that energy, right?
Right.
The only time that solar panel is making power is when the sun hits it.
Right.
But if you need the power at night, you need a battery to carry.
The storage thing is a huge
important.
issue with solar, right? People who criticize solar or at least sort of question its efficacy is you hit these limits of storage.
Right.
And then how does one not only deal with the fact that you hit this battery storage limit, but then it's like the dissemination, right? So storage, and where are we at with dealing with these particular issues? This seems like a space where it's like, all right, we get the panel, we understand how the sun works.
Right.
What are we doing right now about the storage and the sort of dissemination of the energy? Have we seen some new advances from your sort of perspective in that? That seems to be one of the major issues with solar.
There's pure science and physics and a lot of really good research going on. And so this is, part of the challenge, right? There are people who believe they're going to fix it. We'll have fusion. We'll have, nuclear fusion, which we actually have been making some progress in. And
don't say that. They're going to come after you, right? Isn't
it? I know it's probably.
That's the one thing where they really just come right after you.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, and there are many charlatans and selling
solar. You could talk about all day. The second you start talking about fusion,
it's kind of improving. But let's just say that the components, the technical components, exist in the marketplace today. And yes, there are great advances being, achieved in the laboratory in many areas. But as it stands, yes, we have solar panels, and we may end up having to make more of them in the U.S. and who knows how expensive they'll be. Whatever the case may be, we have technical solutions. The batteries are another area where the issue is fire safety. But again, they're making improvements, and they're making improvements in making them safer. But let's just say today and in the very near future, we have the components we need to solve the problem. What we don't have is the business relationships, the implementation methods to wildly scale these up.
So in New York City, if we have a group of different, you called them retail subjects.
Right. Yes.
And that's how they're viewed by the power company. And also the power company, I know here in New York, I know in California, is starting to push back against people putting solar on their roofs because they say that the grid isn't architected to handle that in sort of a decentralized or distributed way, which I do believe is true. But now the question is, well, why can't we re-architect the grid to become more sustainable?
There you go. Because we have systems that are designed for the benefit of a few interests. Utilities if utilities are private, as they are in many parts of the country, they are private companies, and they rely upon that, what's really monopoly power, to make their money. And so, and there's an example of a conflict that just played out again in Albany just last week, maybe even a few days ago, wherein a bill that would take away one of the the foundation rights of utilities to expand the gas system. Right, the gas system is the enemy of a lot of climate activists, because they just don't want the gas system to shrink and go away.
Right, that's been a big
time.
thing. The gas stoves in New York, that's been a big thing. There was I saw a thing today, some of the potentially hazardous effects of gas stoves in the home as it relates to
So they're
the C word and young people. That came out today.
And think about that compounded with areas of New York City. The majority of the dense parts of New York City have multifamily buildings that have oil and gas boilers in their basements, and they're pushing emissions right up into the air in the neighborhoods. So to heat their homes and make hot water for their homes, these areas, and these aren't necessarily all poor areas, some of them are middle class and rich areas, that all are just wed to this old and pretty obsolete technology and habit and inertia. This is how we pay for it, this is how we do it. And we hate our steam radiators, but we kind of love them because we're used to just the same shit all the time, right? So here are cases where people are literally choking themselves from their own. One of the things we said in our Heat Cool Smart Brooklyn campaign to convert is, stop burning fossil fuels in your basement. So all the lovely people who will go pick up signs and go to demonstrate against, a gas pipeline or, a law that allows, the expansion of a power plant or what have you. These are the same people who go home and pay their rent, which goes to pay for oil and gas every single day. And they can't really think about doing it differently because it hasn't been made inspiring and beautiful enough for them to do what they themselves want to do. And that's a failure of, I don't think it's a failure of the marketplace, and I don't think it's a failure of government. I think it's a failure of
the collective. And to a great degree, the strength of the fabric of the collective, which has been shredded in our life and our place and in time, but also the failure perhaps of the artists, and those are the artists not only of the engineering and the architecture and the urban planning, but also the organizational creatives as I presume and hope and pray you will be one who will break this deadlock, break this
our whole thing. Our whole thing, real briefly, Ash. Our whole thing about this is me especially, has been inundated, in the art world. And I've said before, the art world has served me. It's continued to serve others. What is the art world? Is it a few But what this is, and what was sort of fundamental to me, and I would also say us, is the art world has some issues, right? But there's a lot of great things about the complex of publications, galleries, museums, all the administrative individuals, curators, etc., whether in, New York City, Paris, wherever else, there are these like sort of hubs of art, modern art, contemporary art, really. But perhaps we're at a time where the skills developed within that microcosm, small and big though it is, perhaps those skills developed within there could be lent to the world. I hate to say it like, Norm Macdonald, the world, but perhaps it's time for these people, myself included, and this is what this platform is, to take that creativity, take that ingenuity, and take that passion and bring it into the slightly more mundane realm of infrastructure and utility.
And it was Robert Rauschenberg, I believe, who had a dialogue with scientists, and there were several of his artworks or his sort of events or performances that he produced that were based upon this particular idea that artists and scientists need to actually be, working together to
Right.
to solve problems. And just as another aside, one of the programs of the 2030 network. There's a network of the 20 plus cities and lovely, wonderful people and different cities, different climate, different politics. Cincinnati, the Cincinnati district, and the Detroit district, and the Ithaca district, and the Burlington district are all different characters doing different things. There's a museum group, and we have quarterly meetings of people in the museum world, the facilities directors, some of the the people who work on programming in museums, to talk about sustainability in the actual buildings of museums. Tricky problem, right? Museums have to have very, very carefully calibrated environment, the air quality and the filtering and the moisture, the humidity and the temperature and all that, but also they're cultural anchors of their communities, and they're the center for the dialogue about natural history or fine art, or whatever the case may be, in their communities. And so we have this group, and I actually engaged the people from MoMA and the Met in this conversation. It takes a certain kind of capacity that we don't yet have to make these things happen, because it's very easy to get sidetracked onto the 100 different technical questions, the legal questions, the financial questions, the issues of what does it look like, right? Like the view from your window, right? But what does it look like institutionally into the community, right? All these things are yet to be worked out, but I think we need a greater capacity and a much kind of stronger platform and a more flexible platform to achieve some of these solutions. The thing is that people desperately want to do it, but they don't have the vehicle to do it yet, and that's what we're trying to do with NYC 2030. And believe me, there's a lot of inertia. Culturally, people want to do things the same old way. They don't want to be bothered. And so we have to create these apps and these tools and these design elements that make them love this change.
I like the word vehicle you use, and challenge out to the Met rooftop. They have a new thing up right now, and I'm actually friends with the guy who was a big patron for the first ever Met rooftop exhibition. With a Scottish artist, I believe, Andy Goldsworthy, who made these beautiful stone houses.
Goldsworthy is a fabulous character in this conversation, because his medium, I don't know what
often nature.
It's
ephemeral, perhaps.
It's ephemeral, and also just trying to trying to illuminate the natural systems.
But maybe there's some technological function that could be sort of added to his artistic visions, and perhaps a little bit of function making its way into these storied institutions like the Met and its fabulous rooftop series, which has been sort of great over the last few years, especially with notions of representation and things like that. But again, like, can our art institutions, and they certainly have. In fact, I think right after Sandy, there was a huge sort of project, I believe, at MoMA, I could be wrong, that was strictly about the seawall around Manhattan. It was like a big sort of design project that I think was presented at MoMA.
Could very well have been. The big U was one thing, and the issue, again, this gets really, really heavily into the issue of these false silos. The seawall and what is adaptation, right? Resilience, adaptation to rising seas, and protecting protecting Lower Manhattan, which is happening. But the idea that this is, the work of the Army Corps of Engineers, and it's one thing that doesn't relate to anything else, an example of how one can break down the silo and open up the conversation, all of the earth that they're moving to build these seawalls, and they're actually raising the East River Park and building seawalls all around Battery Park City and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
All of the earth that they're moving and all of the heavy, heavy, heavy construction that they're doing just to keep the water out of Lower Manhattan and avoid flooding the 14th Street power plant, which went kapooey during Sandy. None of that is being conceived as having anything to do with sustainability, with energy, with the long-term, protection of the planet from. But all of the earth that they're moving and all the heavy work they're doing could incorporate, as an example, loops for geothermal energy, which would be air, or ground source or water source heat pumps. Could all be incorporated if we were thinking about this as a campus as opposed to a city with 1 million customers, but just as a village that needs to be protected long term. The kinds of thermal energy that we need to run heat pumps, meaning the 45 or 50 degrees of the Earth's temperature or the water's temperature, because basically in an island you're dealing with the same thing, could provide tremendous amount of clean energy resources, as opposed to taking a 30-degree air and making it into 80 to 75-degree air as an air source heat pump does. That ground source, water source, medium temperature for both heating and cooling. It's a lot easier to create heat from 45 degrees than it is from 30-degree air. It's a lot easier to cool with 45 degrees than it is 95-degree air to cool down, right? So that is an asset which we're wasting, because we're moving millions of tons of earth around to keep the water out, but we're not using it as an energy source.
So what would it look like for NYC 2030 to try to address that particular problem?
Oh boy.
And you have, before we have to let you go, you've got about 8 minutes
I've got
to
8
answer
minutes.
this.
I don't know if I can in 8 minutes, but let's just look, let's not even think about massive infrastructure, which we should. We should be able to think about a microgrid in a community that can cut itself off from Con Ed when there's an outage, and independently have some on-site power, some renewable power, some batteries to keep itself going. And when I talk about the roof of the Jackie Gleason bus depot, I'm talking about the potential for having not only power for the bus depot for lighting and for their tools and all that stuff that would be cheaper than potentially the Con Ed, although that's another question having to do with grids, so I'm not going to go there. But if there's a power outage and all the people from Sunset Park are, some of them have medicine that they need to, refrigerate. They need power. They need to charge their phones. The power from the top of that roof could be emergency power for those people.
Right.
And there's no reason it can't, except 1,000 laws and regulations that block it. Right. The same thing has to do with interconnecting to the grid as a private, a private property. Can you get batteries? Can you not? Again, these are very, very complicated problems only because of legal and business structures that we have. Technically, they're not problems. If we were out in the middle of, the middle of Iowa and we needed an off-grid community, I'll pick on Iowa, but you know what I mean. We want an off-grid community, we can have it. We have the capacity to do it. We have solar power, we have batteries, we have geothermal, we have efficient building envelopes. We can do it. It's not a problem. What we have is we have 1,000 interests that all want to keep things the way they are because they're making money the way they are. So let's not think about that infrastructure, although we can. Microgrids, thermal energy networks, batteries that serve both grid resilience, meaning they smooth out the power that comes and goes from the grid, and emergency power in case of an outage, right?
Yeah.
we can do it. We can do it tomorrow, except the business isn't there. So let's look at something like community solar, which is legal and ready to go, right? Community solar is a way that if somebody has a big solar farm on top of a supermarket, on top of a parking lot, on top of a brown field,
a big
somewhere,
box store that just closed, like
yeah.
Target or something.
Yeah, or if it's open, right? And maybe it'll use the power, maybe it won't. Or all of the L trains, all of the elevated trains that have stations and have elevated, railways that could be, or the let's go back to
7, the J.
The viaduct that takes the F train and the G train over the Gowanus Canal, runs about a mile from Park Slope up and over down to Carroll Gardens and into the city. It's a huge structure.
It's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere, and it's holding up the train. It's doing its job. It's done its job for 100 years.
Yeah.
It could be the substrate for a solar and wind installation. That could be a community solar wind installation. So the community solar, which exists, is a way that individual ratepayers, if you got a Con Ed account, you got a Con Ed meter, you can buy your energy from a community solar array that could be in Staten Island, it could be in the Bronx, could be out floating on Jamaica Bay, I guess, or somewhere like that,
Yeah.
But the idea that it's connected to the Con Ed grid and through the on-bill pay relationship that we have, which allows you to buy your energy from any number of different suppliers, you can buy from a community solar farm somewhere, and you can effectively sign up for it. Buy your energy from there. You get a 10% or 15 or 20% discount depending on who does it. The industry standard now is 10% for the private developers who are doing this, but anybody can save a little bit of money and buy their energy from a local solar farm. Okay, why isn't this happening more? One, inertia. People don't know. They're not ready to make the change. But also because it's difficult to build a big solar farm in a city where people don't want to upset their parking lots or upset their roofs. They think everybody who owns a building in New York City thinks the zoning is going to change and they're going to be rich tomorrow because they're going to get to build a big building, right? But more importantly, they're not thinking in terms of a community benefit. They're not thinking in terms of a climate benefit. They're thinking about the bottom line.
Yeah.
And so there has to be businesses and architectural and engineering solutions that make it friendly for them, that I can think, oh, the roof's going to leak, or oh, I'm going to have a problem if I want to, sell the building. So all these things are really significant challenges, but we think that if we can solve them at a kind of prototype scale, a scalable, replicable bucket of this works, let's go do it again. That's what we need to do. We need to find these solutions.
And a call out to people developing these projects. Maybe there can be little collectives of artists, architects, community leaders, and go set these up, and they can pair with financing to say, we actually have financing now to get these things going, and we know that there's a business model here. So I think there where people are maybe looking for what type of ventures to start right now, they're getting laid off, their companies are going through big transitions. Here's a clear business model for collaboration that we're going to need more of, is setting up these projects.
Yes, and that's just one example of an avenue that exists. And another example might be you've got a block, and I don't know how much time but if you've got a block where everybody's got to they're connected on their backyards, right? Well, you don't have to go across the street like Con Ed does to run a power line. Theoretically, you should be able to, and this is a legal question, but it's not a technical question. But if a bunch of neighbors got together and they wanted to have, a hot water tank that they shared and a battery that they shared, and they all had solar panels on their roof, and they all made their buildings a little more efficient, and they also had, heat pumps that ran on air or water. There are ways that a block, and this is a concept that goes back a while, that a block could form a kind of a neighborhood energy collective or a cooperative utility.
Yeah.
And so these are the kinds of models that we need to really work very hard to establish in a way that they become models people want to copy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we talked about before the podcast a few weeks ago was that there are all these programs where building owners can actually get reimbursed or even financing for making their buildings more energy efficient. And from what I understand, NYC 2030 has a whole list of contractors who you can work with, a whole list of plans. There's just not enough people taking advantage of these conversions. So I think one of the things that I'm most excited to help facilitate is both the aggregation of these retail subjects, as you say, as a collective group who can negotiate even better financing deals together and also hold each other accountable to actually making these changes. So I know we have to wrap up soon, but I would like you to speak a little bit to just what that program is and how that could make just a big difference across New York City and other cities if building owners came together and did these collective financing efficiency upgrades.
So that's a concept that we're working as volunteers to promote. Without going into too much detail, as we've described all these silos and all these many different programs, this is to achieve a really effective building energy retrofit, a really efficient and long-term, affordable and healthy building. And we're talking about existing buildings that are going to be around for 100 years, and there's millions of square feet in New York City. The retail subject, as we talked about, the typical building owner, the typical building manager, the typical co-op board president or condo member can't possibly, unless they happen to be in the business, know what all this stuff means and how this all works. And all of the separate programs are there are different regulations, different eligibilities, and on and on and on. Some are run by utilities, by the city or the state or foundations. Federal government's getting out of this business, at least temporarily. So what we're saying is, aggregating and working collectively, we can streamline the processes of getting these incentives, of finding financing, of setting the program, the project management and the sequencing for these things, because a lot of these buildings are very similar. You solve one, you're going to go a long way to solving the others. But if we can also, say, get 8 or 10 or 15 of similar buildings which are facing, in the case of New York City, there are actually mandates to achieve certain benchmarks of efficiency. Working together, we can not only create a kind of a community of practice, which is what we very much want to do, but also get some discounts, get some bulk procurement, force, if necessary, the collaboration between the people in these different sectors. The people from who do solar don't necessarily talk to the people who do roof insulation, right? The people who do building energy controls don't necessarily talk to the people who do what's called demand response, which is a way you can, through practices, use energy when it's available and not force the peak up by all using the energy all at once and causing the grid to be strained, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that can be done through a collective and a collaborative process, not only among the service providers and the contractors and the consultants and the engineers, but the buildings themselves. And then you get an opportunity to do things like a community solar cluster in a particular area, or a green roof cluster, or a community of practice that actually lowers the electric usage during peak demand times, which Con Ed actually pays something towards because it saves them from a blackout. It saves them from having to turn on a peaker plant, which is a dirty, very dirty power plant. So all these things are opportunities to take practical steps. And, there are some things that are fairly simple. Not only, hey, when you use your washer dryer, but also, if everybody had insulating curtains that they closed at 10 o'clock at night and didn't, and kept them off, kept their space a little more and a little better insulated at night, then they could turn their thermostats down, and then, and 100 other practices that have to do with, just a little bit of intent, which once you set it up, it's on. Once you're locked into, you're locked into it. And again, some of these are technical, but a lot of these are just making the commitment as a group, which has so much more power than making it as an individual.
Totally.
And you have to go. So it's officially over.
Oh.
But, around like an hour ago, it hit 80 degrees in New York City.
Oh, really?
Right. And soon it's going to be hotter/warmer than that.
Yeah.
And all these buildings have these AC units. And, we're all guilty here and there of flicking that AC on when it's 90 degrees
right.
and you can't sleep and you got to get up and do stuff the next morning. And we have these modern amenities.
Guilty. Yeah.
What, and this is, we'll walk out and then Ashley can sort of maybe just poke you to give us some information about how people can sort of get involved with you in particular and sort of look into things. But just that every year question of the individual, right? That individual sort of retail surf or whatever, me, you, where we go, oh man, I know that the AC does the thing, but what can we do just there in that little micro situation of the AC? Obviously less is more, but anything new to add on the air conditioner conversation about what the individual can do?
That's what it's kind of interesting. One thing would be the very simple, and this is something that individuals may be able to do this. Probably, I hope there's 100 DIY videos to show you to do it. But if you insulate around the window, which your window AC is in when you're using it, so it's not just you're not just pouring cold air out into the atmosphere. That's something to do, because the typical double hung window isn't really made for an AC, and when you open it, it actually has a lot of areas of leakage around it.
Right.
And then if you can't take that AC out in the wintertime, which you should do, and close that window and make sure that window really closes securely. If you can't do that, then there are covers that you can get. There are like little kind of cozies that you can get that are on the inside or the outside will insulate that, so you're not losing your heat out to it. But it's one of the real challenges to when we say electrify or efficiently electrify a building, which is all the policy in New York City, New York State is moving towards. It means you're gonna lose your fossil fuel boiler. You can stop burning fossil fuel in your basement for heat and hot water, and you're going to switch to a heat pump system, which is heating and cooling. So you have this dissonance between the governance and who pays for what in a building, in a multifamily building or a commercial building. It can get tricky, right? You got to have a green lease or a lease that accommodates that. But you're also asking people to take on a system that gives them cooling. Well, that's a great thing, but it's not apples to apples. So it's very hard to make the calculation as to cost and benefits. But with a warming world, that cooling is really important. And the heat pumps provide very efficient heating and cooling through one system. And you actually can control them. They actually respond to you. There are issues with them. It ain't easy. We've tried to do it. We've done it successfully in some buildings. But we really believe that there's a scale aspect to this, where if you could achieve certain benefits at scale, we don't think there's one size that fits all, one golden silver bullet that does the job. If you have heat pumps, you kind of also have to have an efficient building envelope. You have to have efficient building systems. And if you have solar and maybe some demand response or some other bells and whistles, you can have a much more comfortable, much more healthy environment systems in your building, and also long-term affordability. And that's a challenge because electricity is becoming more expensive, and there's a lot of cheap fossil fuels out there right now, and so it's rough.
Well, what do you think, Ashley?
Well, Haym, thank you for coming in today. I think I'm just excited about NYC 2030 in general as being something that transcends the issue of politicization of issues getting in the way of solving the problem. I think NYC 2030 provides a way for people to take action. I think there's a lot that we can do with good standing in this network as we build it to point people to ways that they can get involved with either NYC 2030 or 2030 in their own town, or get 2030 going in their own place, and start plugging people in, plugging institutions in, plugging companies in to help solve the problems locally. So I'm glad we had you on as our second official guest, because this is
Nice job.
Yes, thank you. Because this is exactly the kind of initiative that we think can help solve problems now in this post-partisan world that we are part of ushering in and stepping into, and that I think more and people are looking for ways that they can make a difference and feel caught up in the political binary of today. So I was very, excited to have this conversation going, and just another kind of, I guess, shout out to the future. I think this Good Standing Ambassador program that we're getting started could have a lot of support for these new business models that actually could help the 2030 objectives, but also help people out there who are looking for what they can do right now. So there's a lot of ideas I know that you have personally. I know they're on the website. We're going to be helping to publicize that. So just kind of a shout out here, if you want to share your website, share any way for people to get in contact with you or follow you, whether it's related to 2030 or your sustainable architecture business that also exists, so don't forget to shout that out.
Well,
so,
I try to not to wear too many hats at once, but let's just say as an architect who has not abandoned my role as an artist, I do believe architecture is a fine art, and I treat it as a creative process. So I'm working on some of these solutions, inventing or designing, and working with some very good, wonderful, smart, capable people, of whom there are many in Brooklyn and beyond, as you probably know, on these problems. And I hope I can succeed in those. And I really do believe, I still have that selfish motive that these solutions will be beautiful and inspiring and will proliferate on their own merits, because they are things that people will want. We've seen some of them, we haven't seen enough of them yet. There's yet a lot of work to be done, for all the people in this work. NYC 2030 can be contacted just by emailing info@nyc2030.org. We have a website that's part of the 2030 Network website. Just search NYC 2030 District or 2030 Districts, and you'll find it. Our website is in a rather Neanderthal state right now. It needs a lot of work, but there's some of the basic information is on there of how you can join as either a property owner manager partner, a civic community partner if you're a not-for-profit or a community group or an educational institution, or as a service professional partner. So you can kind of jump on the platform in any of those three ways. We have a pledge letter, explains who we are. We only charge a small fee to the service professionals because we're trying to make work for you, the practitioners of clean energy. But we also do a lot of webinars, and we work with Pratt and the New School and our friends at this CUNY Building Performance Lab and 350 Brooklyn and
Cool.
many others. And so we're really just building out that platform. We welcome any and all help to do that, and I expect that you already have been helpful and will continue to be. But it really comes out of Red Hook, and it comes out of, Lower Manhattan, and it comes out of the Bronx, and it comes out of Far Rockaway, and it comes out of all places where this is really an enormously important issue, a life and death issue. But we need to show that to everybody else, and the way we show it is to show how we solve the problem in ways that people can join.
Thank you so much. And feel free to reference or throw any of these partners or individuals at us here. We'd love to talk to them as well.
And I can't be more hopeful than I am right now, looking at your platform.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Haym.
Bye-bye.